Okay, we've opened, so it's now open, and the system is bringing in attendees. So we'll give it a couple of minutes uh, until it loads. This session is also being recorded and will be available for people who weren't able to attend to see it on our website. We'll send you the link. You can share it as well. So it will be available. Well, let's go ahead and get started. A number of people have joined us already, and others will be streaming in. But in the interest of keeping the respect for your time and all of your busy schedules, let's indeed get started. Good morning, everyone who's joining us today. My name is Paul Salem. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute, here currently locked down in Washington, D.C., as I imagine everybody's locked down around the world, around the region. Today's session is pandemics and shutdowns, the short and long-term challenges for Middle East and North Africa economies. Obviously, the COVID crisis has massive public health impacts, but also the necessity to deal with it by slowdowns and shutdowns has really had crippling effects on the economy. And if it goes on as it seems for many months, maybe up to a year, it will have very massive effects. Contraction of the economy will hit different sectors differently, will hit different countries differently, and different income groups differently. This is obviously a very huge and vast topic today. We're lucky to have three experts with us looking at particular aspects of this very large challenge and large problem. We have with us Dr. Rania Al Mashat. Dr. Mashat is Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation, joining us today from Cairo. Thank you, Dr. Mashat. She's currently, as I said, Minister of International Cooperation. She was Egypt's first woman tourism minister. Before that, she also served as Egypt's rep at the International Monetary Fund here in DC and was the vice governor of the Egyptian Central Bank. She's very well placed to explain to us how Egypt, on the economic level, is dealing with this very large crisis. We're also lucky to have with us Ms. May Nasrallah. May is the founder and the executive chairman of De Novo Corporate Advisors. This is an independent Middle East focused corporate finance advisory firm. She works on issues of cross border mergers and acquisitions, restructuring, capital raising transactions, and the like. She's currently joining us from Dubai in the UAE, and she's going to help walk us through how she sees, first of all, the governments of the region dealing with this crisis, but also the private sector, how it looks at it, and how it's planning and operating. Joining us from his farm, actually, outside of Washington, D.C., is Jean-Francois Seznek. Jean-Francois is a renowned expert, particularly in the energy field of the Middle East. We're lucky to have him as a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. He's also an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. As I said, he follows the energy sector very much, and the oil price war and the oil price collapse has been a big part of the economic crisis that certainly some countries in the region have been going through. For those joining us online, we welcome your questions. This is an interactive session. I will start with a few questions to our panelists, but please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. You can all see that on the bottom of your screens. So please submit your questions. I will be reviewing those questions and then selecting them to send to our panelists. So I will be managing that conversations. You can begin putting questions right away so that we can integrate those questions into the conversation. That's for those joining us by Zoom. Those who are following the event by live stream on YouTube or other platforms, you can ask your question by Twitter using hashtag MEI events, hashtag MEI events, or send an email to events@mei.edu. So please have your questions coming. If you have any technical problems or technical issues, you can use Zoom's chat function, not the Q&A, but the chat function, or email events@mei.edu. So without further ado, let me turn to Minister Al-Mashat. I know you just had a cabinet meeting today, and you had a long meeting with the president a couple of days ago. Please, tell us how things look from Cairo, how you're dealing with the challenges in Egypt.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I have a very short presentation. And in the first slide of that presentation, it sort of summarizes exactly what the government of Egypt is doing. The government of Egypt is, number one, working on protecting, and that is protecting its citizens from the virus, like all other countries around the world. The second is that we are trying to provide, and provide here goes to providing credit to the households in order to smooth their consumption, but also liquidity to firms because of the disruption that is happening. And then finally, there is going to be a post-COVID world, and that's why progress is very important. How do we think about expediting the structural reforms that we have been working on so that we go through COVID and post-COVID? So it's really a combination of protect, provide, and progress. I like to put those out as really the focus of what I will talk about, and it's the focus of what the government is doing. I'll be also sending you the presentation so that all participants can benefit from it. So, but there is a lot that is happening on the health side, extra labs, field hospitals, testing that is taking place, working very closely from the very first day with the WHO to ensure that all the protocols required are taking place. Egypt is a very populous country. And of course, habits of people are very difficult to change overnight, despite all the threats and the fears around the virus. But so far, the numbers have been reasonable, and that is published also every day. There has been not a full lockdown, but some curfew, so that also people are moderated in terms of their interactions. And as government, we have a very big civil service, as you know, but also there have been very important measures taken to ensure that there's no disruption in the work of government, but also, for example, in my ministry, I only have on average 10 people per day coming out of a ministry that includes more than 1,000. Something else which is very important, digitally, education is taking place. And here I have to mention that many of the reforms that took place in the past, particularly on education, where with the World Bank, we had a reform program to push for digitalization, that has come very much in effect now. So that is important. When it comes to the impact on Egypt's economy, and here I just want to mention that we entered this pandemic crisis with very strong buffers on the fiscal side and the monetary side. And that's because, as you know, we concluded our IMF program June 2019. And the program really created buffers on the fiscal side. So we entered this with a primary surplus. We entered this with more than a year and a half worth of reserves in terms of imports. So the cushion was there. Nonetheless, given the balance of payments being dependent on tourism, being dependent on Suez Canal flows, oil, and what's happening in oil today, all of these issues definitely will put pressure on the foreign, on the balance of payments position, very similar to other countries. Nonetheless, and this is very, very important to mention, the liquidity that is in the market has proven to be quite well. Even with the capital outflows that took place, there have not been disruptions, and that is extremely important for the Egypt story. So, but of course, the biggest challenge is on tourism. And as a previous Minister of Tourism, that is really where the uncertainty is globally. A sector which is quite important, but completely came to a halt. In terms of what the government has done, has taken fiscal measures. There has been money allocated to key sectors, whether it's tourism, exports. Many of the real estate taxes have been basically lifted off. Even the black lists when it comes to people who have not paid taxes in the past, that has been lifted. So really to provide some comfort and confidence that people should continue to feel that the government is there. On the monetary side as well, interest rates were cut. There have been many measures when it comes to credit availability to different firms, SMEs, preferential rates, all that, and it's in the presentation so the audience can take a look at. But I think what is quite key from the central bank side is that the financial inclusion reforms have been brought forward. And on March 20th, many of the reforms that the central bank had planned to do in a while were pushed forward, so that this is creating the digital payments and the digital space to basically also lower the impact of the spread of the virus. But I see this crisis as also one that has a silver lining. And if I can explain that, and it really relates to my first point on progress, and that is expediting reforms that we were going to do anyway, but we bring them forward now. And that includes formalizing the informal sector. In Egypt, we have a very big informal sector. Many of them, because of the curfew in the evening and some of the disruption in terms of movements, are going to be affected. And therefore, cash payments will be provided to them if they are starting to register, and that is happening with respect to also financial inclusion. So bringing forward, formalizing the informal sector. Number two, spreading the social safety net. So pushing on reforms that we have done before to include more households, to include more families is something that is taking place. And then, of course, thinking in the digital space and the financial inclusion space is something which is quite important. The one thing that I also wanted to say is that the UN has come out and warned several times that COVID should not derail us from thinking about SDGs going forward. And that is something that we believe in very much. And that's
sustainable development goals.
Yes, and that is because every reform that we are doing today should not be just a defensive, but it is really offensive in the sense that it is supposed to push the country and its potential post-COVID. And that is the story that Egypt wants to say. I have been in government in different capacities at the central bank in 2008 when the global financial crisis took place, and then in 2011, 2013, and then 2000, and then Minister of Tourism. So in each of these times, there were many challenges for Egypt. Nonetheless, there is a lot of resilience, and I'm sure that we will come out of this one with a good story. And that's why on Thursday of last week, I also launched a new narrative of partnership with our development partners, and that is PMPMP, which is people and projects and purpose. So everything we do today as a government is not just to stem and mitigate the impact of COVID, but it is a way to prepare us for what everyone is talking about today, which is the new normal, whether it's more reliance on digital, whether it's more financial inclusion, whether it's more investment in both the education as well as the health sectors. So everybody's working extremely hard. The government is even in terms of the expediting the coordination amongst itself to be able to push with all of this forward. So I'll stop here and open up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Let me ask you a couple of questions, some of which were posed by members of the audience. But my first question is, in some areas of Egypt, people live obviously so close together. The general response of government has been, social distancing and all of that. How does Egypt deal with that imperative in areas where people, cannot do social distancing?
I mean, it's a reality that we face, and the one thing which is quite interesting about this crisis is that there are many commonalities with other countries. So no country is singled out in this space. So for example, if I take India, if I take some of the other countries, the idea is through continuous media coverage, through continuous messages from the Ministry of Health to explain the threats, etc. People should be able to stay home when needed, etc. All of these messages are resonating to some extent. What we are seeing also in terms of demographics, the age brackets in Egypt are quite younger than in other countries. And that is also playing an important role in the number of cases which are coming up. So of course, I'm not an epidemiologist to be able to say, with 100% certainty, whether it's the demographics or the testing, etc. But the trends that we are seeing is that now I think we're in the 8th week since patient zero, and the numbers continue to be faring in a decent way. So, the next few weeks are quite important. I cannot say if we've peaked or not, but I believe that the country is prepared. Yesterday, there was a very big visual announcements, if you will, the number of field hospitals that exist. As in many other countries, the army is there providing also very important prep work in case the pandemic gets more severe. So I think so far on the health side, it's been manageable, and we hope that continues going forward.
Thank you. There are a number of other questions, but I'll come back to you. Thank you, Minister Mossad. Ms. Nasrallah, let's turn to you. You're in the Emirates. The Emirates obviously banked a lot on being a hub for tourism and conventions and physical meetings. You're also next door to Saudi Arabia, which had a Vision 2030. All of it being impacted by everything we're seeing. How do you see the GCC as governments dealing with it, and how do you see yourself and other private sector people looking at this crisis?
Well, thank you very much. First, it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that everybody participating on this call is healthy and safe and out of harm's way. The question that you asked is a very important one. Clearly, the GCC, like everybody else, has been impacted. We are living exceptional times. Those exceptional times are global, but in the region, specifically in the GCC, we've had a double impact. One impact is out of the COVID-19 related issues and considerations, but the other one has been out of the oil price and oil price deterioration. Clearly, the GCC countries rely predominantly still until today on oil production for their revenues, and they continue to be big subsidizers of their own economies through the oil revenue. So when we get hit by a COVID-19, which requires substantial efforts on the part of governments to address those, and coupled with an oil price deterioration in a significant way, we certainly have a big issue to contend with. If you look at many forecasts right now, they're predicting that the MENA-wide GDP growth to trend to zero from what was otherwise predicted at 2 to 3%. Specifically in Saudi Arabia, the prediction is down to 0.8% from 1.7 or thereabouts. I think different people have various different predictions. But more importantly, also UAE, which was predicted to be growing at closer to 2.5%, is now predicted to be negative growth. And that will have its own ripple impact across the region as well. Now, if I can maybe sort of dissect my words into three areas. One is COVID-19 and what the governments are doing to address that. Two is what they're doing from a measurable way for the public sector, and what's happening in terms of impacts on the private sector. First of all, on COVID-19, I have to say, as someone who lives in this part of the world, it's been quite impressive how quick the governments have reacted and the measures and the actions that they have taken. Schools, for example, in the UAE have been off for over a month now. We've now started homeschooling, and schools will be off for the remainder of the year. We have all been encouraged to work from home, and for the past 2 weeks, we've been actually required to be under home curfew nowadays for 24 hours a day. So you only have to leave the house if you have exception to leave the house. There's been fumigation efforts that have been put across the country, fumigations of all the streets, etc. And hospitals have taken very dramatic action towards addressing the issue of COVID and taking a lot of measures for them to have enough hospital beds and enough oxygen tanks, etc., for be able to address the influx of potential patients. Now, the UAE, you can see, and GCC in general are amongst the highest testing per capita globally. But like Egypt, given the predominantly young population, the expectation is that the mortality rate, inshallah, will not be as significant as it is in some other countries that have aging populations. So by and large, people here believe that the governments have been quite good in reacting, and there's a lot of widespread positive sentiments towards the great job that the government is doing in handling the specific cases thus far. Now, if I can turn to the economy and the economic impact of everything and what's going on right now, the regional governments, broadly speaking, have all announced stimulus programs and stimulus packages to help pump into the economy. Let me go through them perhaps one by one. Predominantly in the Saudi Arabia, KSA has announced overall about 120 billion Saudi riyals in stimulus program. Originally it was 50 billion, and then it was followed by another 70 billion, and the expectation is that it will even double that in the coming week, so to get to closer to 240 billion Saudi riyals. The Riyadh is also reviewing its 2020 budget, and funding will be reallocated to sectors that are in most need, such as healthcare. And the real fundamental issue that Saudi now faces, though, is how much of a flattening curve is it going to be witnessing, and therefore how long dated will this issue be? In other words, if it's a short dated issue, it can be handled through the stimulus programs, through injection, through aggressive action. But if the length of the oil price deterioration is long, and if the need to spend on supporting the economy and the public sector and the private sector is lengthened, then we're going to have a meaningful issue to contend with. Today, Saudi Arabia has a shortfall in its budget. It has a budget deficit of around 180, 190 billion Saudi riyals. But if this should continue for a while, the predictions are that it could go as high as 650 to 700 billion Saudi riyals in terms of deficit. And that becomes a more meaningful issue to contend with, because when that happens, then it'll have to consider major changes in its expenditure program. It's got a lot of planned investment that it has wage bills, it's got public sector wage bills specifically, and it'll have a lot of ripple impact to the economy. So the timeline of this issue is going to be a precursor and determinant in terms of how deeply felt this whole down cycle will be. That's in Saudi. In the UAE, the stimulus program has been quite dramatic. It's around 256 billion dirhams right now, so $70 billion. And that again has been doubled and doubled and doubled over the past few weeks. Every week they've actually doubled it to get to the $70 billion. And the stimulus package there has been predominantly put into the banking sector. And the banking sector in such that it's giving them lower reserves, it's giving them more interest-free loans for them to lend to the private sector. It's giving them a lot of abilities for them to maneuver in supporting the public and the private sector industries that actually need economic support. However, the issue with that has been, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more, is the ability for banks to lend to the private sector when they themselves might actually end up getting hit for lending to the private sector when they're not getting guarantees against those loans. So perhaps today you can lend a little bit more, but you don't know whether that company is going to survive, again, depending on the length of the issue and how severe the whole issue is going to be. So there's a lot of, if you want, wait and see in terms of that impact on the private sector. But I'll talk more about that in just a minute. The UAE has also announced just today that it'll be issuing a bond, 3 bonds, in fact, a 5-year, a 10-year, and a 30-year, the size of which will be determined. But it's looking to shore up its liquidity clearly for it to continue to battle with this. Kuwait, has had shutdowns as well. It's also announced its plans to go to the KIA and request some funds to be flowing back into the government in order for it to flow it back into the economy and predominantly into the banking sector. Qatar has had less of an issue more broadly. They've had a less aggressive policy on lockdowns right now, but they have also announced, to put on hold any major expenditure programs that they have. And they're also looking at themselves issuing a bond. So they've done those measures. Bahrain, everybody relies on Saudi to support Bahrain. And Bahrain has taken some pretty aggressive measures itself. They have a great team, very active, very proactive, looking to do whatever it takes for them to support their economy. But at the end of the day, really a lot of it is going to depend on how healthy Saudi is going to be to see how Bahrain fares through all of this. Oman might have a bit of a riskier position, but again, Oman has enough in its reserves right now for it to be able to support this cycle, assuming that the cycle doesn't go too long and then it'll have to privatize for us to continue to address the issue longer term. Now, if I can get to the real economy impact. Now, we've seen that the governments have done a lot of measures to support, a lot of measures to pump in liquidity, a lot of measures to try to keep the SMEs and even the large corporates functioning. But in reality, as we're all feeling it, it's very hard for the government in the measures that they've currently taken to have a big impact on the real economy. Reason being is that banks are reluctant, as we said, they're reticent to lend without getting government guarantees against those loans. A bank still needs to make money. A bank still needs to be profitable. A bank will also have to have its own reserves measures, and they don't want to increase their NPLs. So although the liquidity is provided to them, they're not required to invest it. So there's a bit of a lag, if you want, between the money being pumped in and that money being actually spent on the real economy and the people who actually need it the most. There's been measures that have been put in to perhaps give 6 months, a moratorium on rental payments to be paid in 6 months' time, some moratoriums on fees and dues and penalties and what have you. But again, the issue is more fundamental. The issue is fundamental in the sense that these companies are uncertain about their future and uncertain about their ability to withstand beyond a few weeks. And now we're going to go into months. So I see that there's going to be a very significant impact to be hit on the region as a whole, UAE being perhaps in the eye of that storm, because the UAE has been hit from several angles and will likely fall into a recession as a result of the fact that it's reliant a lot on tourism, it's reliant on travel. It was betting a lot on Expo 2020, which has been postponed for another year. So there's been a lot of things that have been hit on it that makes it very difficult, despite the best efforts of the government, despite the best efforts of what they're trying to do, the fundamentals are shifting. I mean, we're sort of going through this kind of seismic shift that's going across the region. And Saudi, to the extent that it can continue to support the expenditure program that it needs, it will have to diversify away from its own reliance on oil. It will have to eventually end up spending less on wages. It will have to end up taxing more. It will have to end up postponing some of its programs and developments and projects that it's put together, which again will have its own ripple impact on the rest of the region. So where I'm sitting, I see a pretty meaningful, deep-rooted, substantial impact on the entire region, which is going to go from either bad or nasty, depending on how long and how deep-rooted this situation continues. But maybe I'll stop there and see if there's any questions before.
Yeah, thank you, May. A number of people were asking, I mean, for example, in the UAE, obviously, there's a very large expatriate community, which is very much the labor force in many cases. What's happening and what are the policies, A, to protect them, provide them certainly with public health, but also are there protections against them falling quickly into unemployment? Such a huge expat community. How is, for example, the UAE addressing that?
So most of the measures that have been enacted, particularly in Saudi, but also we've seen a bit of it in the UAE, has in the first instance been to protect the local indigenous worker force. So it's really meant to address that mostly. But secondly, on the expat community, look, clearly the healthcare system is across the board. So that's being provided to everybody. There's deep concerns about labor camps. As you know, we have a lot of blue-collar workers and they sit in labor camps. There's a lot of concern about what might happen if one person gets it and how widespread is going to go. So there's a lot of measures being taken there. There's been makeshift hospitals that have been put together in areas where it has 3,000 beds and looking at oxygen supplies and what have you. So they're trying to do a lot to address the healthcare side of it at the very least. Now, the economic side of it is a different issue. The economic side of it, I think, is one where they still need to do a bit of work. I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now as to what happens. People are fending for themselves, so to speak, right now. So anybody who has a company or an SME, they're trying themselves to deal with their own payables, with their own receivables. I mean, we've got a backlog of payables, let alone receivables. So the whole system is hemorrhaging. And I think we're going to see a lot of issues. We're going to see a lot of people leaving the country. We're going to see a lot of businesses being closed down. I'm not sure that a lot of them fundamentally will survive if the long-term downturn that we're going to be witnessing over here. But to the extent that it's possible, I believe that the government will start taking more proactive initiatives to make sure that it's at least addressing this. I mean, to me, a perfect example is how the US is handling their own expenditure. I mean, they're In the US, I see examples of SMEs being granted and gifted or given cash to pay their employees. They're saying, here it is. What do you need? How do you need to support yourself? We don't want you to lay these people off. Here's salaries for the next 6 months or through August or what have you. It's these types of measures that I think would be very interesting and important to implement. But so far, we have not seen that happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, May. Jean-Francois, let me turn to you. The region, as one of the participants said, is experiencing a double whammy, a double white swan, black swan, gray rhino, whatever you want to call it. The COVID crisis is pretty much medium term. I mean, months, maybe a year, maybe more. The oil crisis has potentially a different dynamic. It started, with a Saudi-Russian sort of disagreement, but there's also a meeting tomorrow. And so it could be a short-term crisis. It could be a long-term crisis. How do you see the dynamics of the oil price, oil war? What do you expect? How do you see it affecting the sector?
Well, I'm not terribly optimistic, actually, about the very medium-term future, actually, of the situation. I mean, the COVID crisis has been absolutely hitting the Gulf tremendously, and of course, hitting every oil producer, whether it's the Gulf or even the United States, which is the largest producer at this point. And countries like Canada and Nigeria, who play a huge role in the energy sector. But there was a report yesterday from Bloomberg stating that the demand, the world demand for crude oil may decline by up to 35 million barrels a day, which is absolutely humongous. Now, more reports are talking about 15, 18 million barrels a day, but 35 is definitely a possibility, because if we hit a recession, and a very major recession, some people have even used the word depression, the new 1929 type things, then we have a major issue, because even if the meeting tomorrow is somewhat successful, and I expect there will be some face-saving arrangements tomorrow, but it's still, even the cuts will not come close to meeting the cratering in demand. I think the Saudis may decide to cut 3 million barrels. The Russians may go along and say, okay, we'll promise to cut 3 million barrels as well. And we all hope that the United States companies will all go bankrupt and cut production by 6 million barrels or more. So I think there's a lot of wishful thinking. The Saudis certainly do not trust the Russians, because the whole reason this crisis started on the price issue is because the Saudis wanted to teach a lesson to the Russians, who always promised to cut but never did. So whether or not Mohammed bin Salman can force Putin to negotiate downwards by that much is a little hard to fathom, because Putin doesn't really like to be pushed around too much, as far as we can tell, especially by a 35-year-old leader. So in any event, I think the situation can be pretty dire, because let's assume they even agree to cut, as I said, by, say, 10 million barrels altogether, including the bankrupt US companies. It's still not come close to what's needed to keep the markets going. The storage facilities worldwide are absolutely full. I was just reading yesterday that tankers are being used for storage, and the price of a tanker has gone from $40,000 a day to $200,000 a day. So at least that's a good business to be in. But they just cannot continue to pump oil, because there's no place to put it. So of course, we've all read reports whereby the price of oil will then go down to $15. And they did say that some Canadian companies are actually paying to produce oil because they're paying people to take it. On the other hand, I think that's exaggerated, of course. But for the Saudis and the Russians to hope that the US will cut production substantially, I think is probably difficult. The US government has no power to force US companies to cut production. The only power they have is let them go bankrupt. And some of them may do that, but before they go bankrupt, they'll continue producing because they've already sunk the money. They've already put the money in the wells, and the wells are producing. So at least it's creating a little bit of cash, which allows them to keep their head above water for some time. So many people are saying that we will not see much of a change in production for another year, which means at least the price of oil will remain very low for another year. So that has major impacts, of course, on the Gulf. And the income of the Gulf is going to continue declining very much. And I think May has explained extremely well what the problems are for that. I think in Saudi Arabia in particular, we may see some major reevaluation of what the future of the development will be. I think a lot of the big projects like NEOM and Amwala and all these projects will, not come to fruition. The money has to be spent on something else. Now, which is interesting because there were a lot of efforts in Saudi Arabia already to go downstream into very advanced chemicals, very value-added chemicals. That sort of approach was sort of pushed back a little bit when Khaled al-Falih was kicked out. Now he's back to a certain extent. I think we may see the Saudis going back to that kind of a development where they have a natural advantage on very low cost carbon molecules, the lowest in the world, and they can go away from crude oil. I think they have they know that they cannot rely on crude oil, but they really have now to continue pushing very hard the development in chemicals, in fertilizers, and not only in Saudi Arabia, but worldwide, so they can have a base load of production. I think we'll see that quite a bit. I think May has covered the UAE extremely well. I think in Qatar, we could see some major problems in Qatar because the price of gas has gone down to basically less than production cost. And today, Qatari LNG is going to the Far East at $3 per million BTU, including the travel, including the transportation. So the amount of money Qatar is making is very little. Now, this has some major impacts for Qatar because, yeah, they have a lot of money in their sovereign wealth fund, the QIA, but it's extremely illiquid. And if they decide to sell some of the assets of the QIA in order to raise cash to pay to pay people and to pay for their projects, they're going to take tremendous losses because they cannot sell quickly real estate or a lot of the companies they own and so on. So ultimately, they're faced with either cutting the projects, and they started yesterday by announcing that they will no longer do the 30% increase in LNG production, 50% increase in LNG production, which they had planned. What they will have problem admitting is whether or not they will continue spending billions of dollars on the World Cup 2022, because there's a lot of face at stake here. And I'm not sure the Qataris can honestly do it. So one thing they did, as May mentioned, they will borrow money, and they've just announced, was it yesterday, I believe, that they are trying to borrow $5 billion, which is really a drop in the bucket in this case. And I'm not sure the banks will go along with that, and I don't know at what rate. So we'll see. But in any event, Qatar is a little bit over a barrel here, and I don't know how they will react. It's the same a bit in the UAE, I think, in the sense that Abu Dhabi had some major projects on developing their sour gas reserves and to increase oil production to 4 million barrels, I think, and they probably have, that's why here, put those projects on the back burner for the time being. I think a lot of the Abu Dhabi projects also will have to go away. I mean, all this trying to create a new financial center and so on to compete with Dubai next door and the new harbor, the Al Khalifa harbor, to compete with Jebel Ali, I think will no longer make much sense. On the other hand, I'm much less negative about Dubai. I think ultimately Dubai will end up doing well because Dubai always does well in crisis. I'm not sure how they'll do it, but they have done it hundreds of times in the past. And I can see that a lot of people from around the world will see Dubai still as a haven. A quick word on North Africa, since we haven't talked about this. I think one of the countries that may suffer the most is Morocco, because on the one hand, the very low cost of energy is very positive for Morocco. I mean, it's the largest, or one of the largest producers of phosphates in the world, of advanced phosphate, DPAs, and so on, which require a lot of sulfur, a lot of natural gas, which now they can get at a very big discount. So it's going to make Morocco much more competitive in the world market. And that's great. But their tourism is, as Dr. Al-Mashad mentioned, it's the same as in Egypt. Their tourism is getting leveled. It's gone. And that is going to create a lot of problems for Morocco. A side issue is that if the big projects we've talked about in the Gulf get canceled, many expatriates will have to leave the Gulf. And that's going to create enormous problems for the countries that are dependent on remittances. Morocco is one of them. Jordan is one of them. Of course, Egypt is much lesser than before, still one of them. And countries like Kerala in India and the Philippines are just going to have tremendous problems. So in the long term, the long-term recession will really hurt everybody. But we will see some major changes in the Gulf.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Francois. Let me go back to you, Minister Mossad. A number of questions asked by the audience. One, could you explain a bit the interaction in Egypt between the oil and gas price collapse and the economic situation in general? How big of an impact? Is it different impacts in different sectors? How are you dealing with it, including, as Jean-Francois mentioned, the expat issue of a lot of Egyptians working in the Gulf? Minister Mossad, you seem to be frozen. Well, let me turn to Ms. Nasrallah until we get Minister Mossad back. May, you're in the UAE. We've heard a lot about it. You're also Lebanese. And I know you've been following the economic crisis in Lebanon, which predated the COVID crisis, and now we're in the middle of a COVID crisis. Could you tell us a bit how you see the depth of the economic crisis in Lebanon?
I think Lebanon's problems are going to make the GCC look like child's play in terms of everything we're talking about, where that's going to sit in the greater scheme of things. Unfortunately, Lebanon had been going through a very massive downturn economically. Clearly, politically, it's in a bit of a mess, but economically and financially, it was in real dire straits ahead of COVID-19. And it was going through its worst downturn that we've ever seen, frankly, in our lifetimes. Certainly not worse than the civil war. Fundamentally, Lebanon had been suffering from spending beyond its means for many years, and a substantial amount of leakage in the earnings that the government had made. So there's corruption, there's abuse of funds and what have you, to a point where debt over GDP got to almost 170 to 180%. And it was in dire needs of a full massive restructuring, let alone an expenditure of government expenditure to be halted. Then we get hit with COVID-19. And COVID-19 needs, as we've seen in the GCC, as we've seen in Saudi and Egypt, in the UAE, you need to be able to pump in liquidity. You need to be able to provide for your citizens. And we need to be able to provide for your economy, for your companies, etc. And Lebanon was running on empty ahead of COVID-19. And now post that, it's in such a negative position that we're all very, very concerned about where this ends. So we have severe unemployment that's increasing. We've got now over 700,000 people below the poverty line. There's a massive amount of liquidity that's unavailable. People can't even get their own deposits out of their own banks. And so we're facing a pretty severe Armageddon type situation in Lebanon. My hope, and today, actually a bit earlier today, there was a leak of a document that was put together by the Ministry of Finance, which was submitted to the Prime Minister's office and to the ministers for approval for an economic strategy and a plan for them to try to tackle this issue. What it showed is a few things that are interesting. Number one is finally there's been a public display of the fact that we need an IMF program to come in. So that's one thing that is, I think, positive fundamentally. But two, it shows the amount of the whole of the BDL, of the central bank, and it's quite negative. We're talking about over $80 billion worth of negativity in there, which alone would need to be refinanced, which means that there's going to be a haircut on deposits, there's going to be a haircut in the banks, and the banks will need to be recapitalized. So there's a massive issue that is percolating in Lebanon that does not, it cannot be solved on its own. It certainly needs an IMF injection. It needs an IMF program. It needs help beyond even the IMF from GCC countries, from the international community, from DFIs. And I think right now, unfortunately, the pecking order, it's gone quite low as a result of everything else that the world is facing. So it's in dire straits.
Thank you, May. Minister Mossad is back with us. Minister Mossad, I wanted to ask you a question that was relayed by one of the members of the audience. I hope you're hearing me. The image is frozen. Up, we've lost her again. So let me turn to Jean-Francois and shoot a number of questions from our audience. Jean-Francois, if you dig a bit deeper into the situation in Saudi Arabia, both the decision-making as to how we got here, some people would say, it's a rush decision, miscalculation, to actually sort of go to price war with Putin on this. How do you read that? And then more of a structural, question. If this double crisis of COVID and the oil price goes on for a year and a half in Saudi, what do what would that mean in terms of public mood, the private sector? I know it's a very broad question, but I do want to relay some of the questions of the audience. How do you see this decision? How do you see it playing out in Saudi Arabia?
Very well. And if we are lucky enough to get the minister back, please interrupt me, go straight to her so we don't lose her again.
We will try. Okay.
But well, I think definitely there was a bit of a miscalculation in the sense that.
Okay, Jean-Francois, based on your, since we have the minister back, let's quickly and try not to lose her. The question is, Minister Mossad, how do you see the interconnection between the oil and gas crisis or price crisis and the Egyptian economy? How do they interact?
So first, there have been reforms in the oil and gas over the past few years. So in terms of the price at the pump, if people are going to resume activity, is going to be less, which is a good thing. Of course, Egypt has done a huge effort in terms of exploration of oil. And given that many of those firms are American firms and European firms, they are suffering from the decline in oil prices. So that will definitely affect the exploration going forward. So that is the key risk when it comes to the decrease in oil prices. In terms of the trade balance, exports versus imports, I think on that we might square, because we did do well over the past years in terms of moving the situation on the oil to sort of square. On the gas, just as was mentioned, the gas prices have been impacted. We export gas, so there is an impact as well. So I think the longer the oil prices drop, the impact on companies is going to affect the exploration in our side, and I think that's the key risk that we face.
Thank you. Another question also asked sort of about, not exactly a foreign policy question, but the people of Gaza are one of the most vulnerable in the Middle East. They're in very, very cramped conditions, very difficult. Obviously, Egypt controls one of the borders with Gaza. Do you know anything? I know it's not exactly your remit, but do you know anything of Egyptian government policy today towards the people of Gaza and this particular COVID and socio-economic crisis?
No, I don't think that there has been any shift in whatever policy was done before. So I'm not in a position to comment just because I have not been following closely. But there has not been any change, related to closing borders, etc., because of COVID. So I think it's more or less as was the case before the outbreak.
Okay, and on the question of remittances or Egyptians coming back from the Gulf or sending less money, what's the situation?
So of course, yeah. So remittances is an important component of the balance of payments, and it's not. I mean, the risks are to the downside, given everything that we just heard. So we are in our projections taking into account, different scenarios with the cut that will happen because of remittances. And I think every country today, is changing its financing gap estimates day by day. So I even, on calls with the IMF and on calls with the World Bank, just this concept of which countries are sustainable. How do you define sustainability? Particularly debt sustainability in these circumstances. These are very challenging times for anyone who's working on macroeconomic frameworks, but I believe that the whole point of trying to minimize as much as possible the extent of the lockdowns, we see many countries around the world today thinking more about age brackets who would stay at home, trying to, in some instances, have more people stay within sites for production to continue. So I think in the next couple of weeks, there might be a different dynamic when it comes to the imposed lockdowns that countries are doing. And again, what this crisis has shown is that the concept of contagion is there. I know that after the global financial crisis, this whole concept of are we coupled or decoupled as emerging markets and advanced markets, I think what this pandemic has shown is that countries are very, very, very coupled and very, very, very susceptible to contagion. So as lockdowns in different countries get a little bit more strategic, I think that is going to have some positive impact globally on activity, on movement of goods, even on oil prices.
Well, we've mentioned the WHO, obviously the IMF, and you were also at the IMF previously. Egypt has had very close economic relations quite recently with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries. In this crisis, is there a, sort of a regional, are you reaching out? Is there more regional cooperation? Is this an opportunity for more, regional cooperation? Are you seeing it? Or is each government so busy with its own affairs that actually it's a moment of isolation, that Egypt is dealing with Egypt, Saudi with Saudi, and so on?
I think the world today is in the G20 is led by Saudi Arabia. So that is one of the very, it's a fact. And therefore, most of the initiatives when it comes to what the globe is doing is actually done on the platform of the G20, and of course Saudi is definitely there, given that it's holding that leadership role. No, I think discussions are always ongoing. The region, I think what is quite telling now is this private-public dialogue that is very important, because governments are trying to provide the comfort, the confidence, the liquidity required for the private sector to continue. And whether you're talking about Saudi, you're talking about UAE, you're talking about Egypt, it is this type of understanding of how the market works and where you can actually come in effectively to affect the real sector, where you can come in and make sure that people's purchasing power is cut not by 100%, but at least there's some fuel there to create that consumption. I think one of the maybe positives for Egypt is that it's a big country. The demand is there. It's diversified. We don't depend on one sector only, even though some of on the BOP side, tourism is big. But internally and over the past few years, through the different development projects that were taking place and infrastructure that was there, I think there is some traction on some of the sectors. So these are all weighing in our sort of policy mix as government when we are thinking about the future. And that's why I started my words at the beginning, is that we are thinking of the post-COVID really, because we know that this is a situation, it will take its duration, but really how do we create the jobs for after? What sorts of reforms are we going to be pushing quickly? Because remember that there's so much quantitative easing now in the world, so much money is being pumped in, and if it doesn't make itself to the real sector in these respective countries, it would want to invest somewhere. So you want to be able to stand out as a story so that this capital can come and find a place to be. And that, I think, is what's going to distinguish us, hopefully, as we are thinking through this in a very systematic and structured way.
Thank you. Jean-Francois, back to you. We're running towards the end of this hour, but a quick response on Saudi, then a couple of questions to Ms. Nasrallah. Hold on. You were muted.
Oh, oh.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. I think what we are seeing is that Saudi Arabia has about $500 billion of cash reserve, and they can see the downturn for quite some time, and that's probably what allowed them to actually go on a price war with Russia, because they felt pretty comfortable they could last a big problem. I don't think they could last a huge problem as the one shown by COVID, but at least they can last a little longer. The more of a problem is for the countries where all the cash reserves, the money reserves, are held by sovereign wealth funds, which are very illiquid, like the one in Qatar I mentioned. The same really applies to ADIA, because we don't really know what ADIA has, but we know that it cannot be sold on the market unless they lose a lot of money today. So it really limits their ability to fund the problems, hence why they're borrowing 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, as mentioned. So ultimately, I think the price war has created a sort of a problem for the long term, in the sense that I don't think we'll see prices of oil go up substantially, which is good for people who use a lot of gasoline and so on, but which will be very difficult for the Gulf countries.
Thank you, Jean-Francois. May a couple of questions that relate in a way to foreign affairs, but one is about the GCC, which has been split for a long time. Has there been any movement during this crisis, to reach Qatar with the others, or the others with Qatar? Anything at all like that in the air? Do people think this is a moment to get beyond the old differences?
I mean, I haven't heard anything publicly being talked about, but as Jean-Francois was saying a bit earlier, I actually think that this will thaw the ice between these nations. At the end of the day, Qatar is going to need to have a successful World Cup. Qatar will probably need to diversify a little bit the expenditure program that it has. Saudi's been desperately trying to get that. One of the biggest issues in their talks previously was this. So they had discussions, they were talking about getting the relationships to be normalized again, but when it came down to this, Qatar did not want to share it, Saudi wants to share it. Talks, at least from what my understanding, stopped as a result of that. I think in light of what's happening right now, everybody needs everybody else. Today is a day where you have to put an olive branch out there, literally across not just the GCC, but the entire Arab world as well. I mean, if we can't make this current crisis be a reason for these countries to get together and start acting in the benefit of collectively all of them, then I think we're not going to see a day repeat itself for that opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad that it would take a virus to remind us that we're all humans, but it seems to be that. Related to that theme, again, a question asked by one of the audience members. Dubai is one of the biggest Iranian cities, in the sense that there's a lot of Iranians there and Iranian business. You're very close to Iran. Obviously, the Iranian economy was going through all kinds of problems for many reasons, including the lockdown from the US, as it were. The questioner is asking, sitting where you are in the UAE, how is the impact, the economic impact, in addition to all the other impacts, how do you see it playing out in the Iranian economy?
I have to say, my biggest hope, I mean, I'll take what I just said about Qatar, UAE, and KSA, and I will apply it to Iran, and I would also apply it to Israel. I think this is a time for us to think about broadening all of these relationships. I'm seeing a lot of proactive and front-footed, if you want to approach in the UAE, at least towards Israel. I'm seeing Israeli representative, not Jewish, but Israeli representative companies, groups, what have you, coming in and talking about way to collaborate and way to do things forward. With Iran specifically, I mean, Iran, the historical relationships between the UAE and Iran has been quite substantial. There's been a lot of flow of money, there's been a lot of flow of people, there's a lot of flow of business that has happened historically. Now, the events over the past few years have clearly changed all of that dynamic and has resulted through all of these sanctions that have been applied for that to stop. And I think the UAE has suffered as a result of those ties being somewhat hampered or severed, but also the ties with Qatar being hampered and severed, because I don't know if you know this, but about 95% of all imports that go into Qatar come out of the UAE. So there's a flow that comes out of that. So today, all of these things need to be mended. I was a little bit surprised, though, to see that over the past couple of weeks, more shells have been from Yemen into Saudi Arabia have come out. I mean, I wouldn't have expected that this is a reason for everybody to say, okay, let's take a deep breath now and try to figure out a way for us to all collaborate and work together going forward. I don't know. I mean, I think the whole Iran-Saudi situation is an important elephant in the room. It needs to be solved. It needs to be resolved. Today, the economies need to have an excuse for them to have commerce with one another. And again, this should be an excuse for that to happen. But I haven't seen signs of it just yet. But my optimist in me is hopeful that this would be an impetus for that. If I may, I would like to just make one last comment as well, if I can. Not
Sure.
what you asked, but I also think one important consideration that a lot of the countries around this region specifically, but also around the world will have is the whole supply chain cut. We've been living in a globalized world for a number of years. This event that has happened has shown the need for that supply chain to not be so seamless across the globe, but a lot of countries, I believe, will become very focused on self-sustainability. So going back to countries like the Saudi or like the UAE or even Egypt, who have the means and the capabilities for them to actually build better supply chains within their own borders, I think they're going to spend a lot of time and effort trying to make that happen. Because if you should ever have an event like this happen again, and you need to be able to fend for yourself, more and more countries are going to look at that as an important measure for it to be taken versus fully diversifying globally. Self-protection is going to be a key that I think we'll see going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, May. This has really been a very rich, very interesting hour. As promised, we're keeping it to an hour. There's so many more issues to cover, obviously, so many more countries. You touched on Iran. We have Turkey. Jean-Francois touched on Morocco. There's questions about Tunisia and Jordan, West Bank, Syria, Yemen. It goes on and on. We at the Institute will continue to be holding these sessions to cover as much as we can. But I want to thank all of our panelists. Minister Rania Al-Mossad, thank you for joining us from Cairo. Good luck in your efforts in our beloved Egypt. Good luck there. May and Nasrallah, thank you for joining us from Dubai. Good luck to you there. Good luck to Lebanon, as you say. We're also both Lebanese. Many problems there. Jean-Francois, thank you for joining us to cover the oil and gas sector. And I want to thank our audience who was with us for this hour. As I said, this session is recorded and will be available on our website later as well. Stay safe, stay well, and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.